You are listening to
The Shredcast.
No tendies, baby.
It's the health code for snowboarders.
Let's send it.
Welcome back to the Shredcast, everyone. I'm so stoked because today we have Alyssa, who is the owner of Ironclad Physio. She is a physical therapist and orthopedic specialist, as well as a sports physical therapist out in Breckenridge, Colorado. You guys might recognize her from Tommy Bennett. She is the physical therapist that works on his hip. If you know, you know. And she's absolutely amazing. She's been doing like stuff with NFL people and Olympic specialists just for the last 10 years. And then recently moved into creating her own business for Ironclad Physio and working with a lot of CrossFit athletes. So welcome to the Shredcast. How are you, Alyssa?
I'm great. I'm stoked to be here. Thanks for having me on.
Yeah, of course.
Miss via Tommy.
Yeah. I know. It's so funny. I love talking to him about his hip. He just acts like, I mean, it's a crazy injury if anyone knows like the depths of it, and definitely a long rehab process, but he's so funny about it. He just makes it seem like some days he'd be like, oh, it doesn't even exist. Other days he's like, I can't snowboard my hip.
Yeah, and he's funny. So I texted him last night. I was like, look, it goes against everything in my PT nature. Like, talk about you. He's like, no, dude, it's totally fine. So he's been really sweet about like, he's like, yeah, you can talk about my hip. I was like, okay, good. I just had to check.
Yeah, totally, totally. Well, awesome. I'd love to just kind of start from the beginning. You're from Louisiana, New Orleans,
Yeah,
something like
I'm
that,
from
right?
New Orleans, Louisiana. Yeah.
Yeah. So how did you kind of get into physical therapy and make it out to Colorado?
Yeah, most physical therapists will tell you we got into PT because we got hurt at some point.
Nope.
So I had my own series of injuries. I played sports growing up, ran track in college for Michigan, and had an injury there that kind of started like I had to go to some PT for. So I started to get an idea of it. My mom's also an OT, so that helps. I grew up in clinics. And then when I kind of like graduated undergrad, I was still thinking medical school. So I went home and started working as a PT tech while I was still taking some prereqs for med school. And I was like, oh, yo, like PT is actually really cool. Like that was my first view of what a sports PT looked like. And so that I was really drawn to that. And one of the work-life balance that comes with PT that does not necessarily come with being an ortho surgeon, and all my ortho surgeon friends will probably attest to that. Um, and so I went that route. I went to PT school for my ACL while I was in PT school. So that really kind of sucked me in further on like, how do I get back to being what I would consider an athlete? And then started working. I worked in New Orleans for 4.5. So I lived in New Orleans for 7 years before I moved here. Worked there for 4.5, but always had this dream of like wanting to work with professional athletes, and really, really liked the idea of working with what we would call non-traditional professional athletes. So like snowboarders.
Mhm.
And so the company that I work for now, Howard Head, is an official medical provider for the US ski and snowboard team. So I was like, yo, I got to go there. Like, that's how I get to work with professional snowboarders. And so I got a job offer, packed up my shit, moved across the country, didn't know anybody, on the chance that I was going to get to work with the US snowboard team. And I did. That opportunity came in 2019. Super cool.
That's
Yeah,
super cool. So did you snowboard at all before coming out here, or you just
I
were?
did. A lot of people are like, how the heck did you learn how to snowboard as a Louisiana kid? My dad lives in Michigan. So I grew up, I learned how to ski when I was like itty bitty. His method was like put us behind him. So if we went too fast, we just face planted into his butt, which is, it's effective. And then I switched to snowboarding when I was like 12.
Okay.
Because it was like the cool thing to do, and I wanted to do it, and I was always drawn
Still
to
is.
it. I just fell in love with it. I fell in love with it, and I haven't looked back since. And so that was my snowboard start. I didn't snowboard out west until probably college, and I had never
Okay.
ridden Breck when I moved here. I was like,
Yeah.
it's good. Here we go. Yeah.
Yeah, that's so cool though. And so then you were working with snowboarders, you were working with other professional athletes. And so what made you kind of switch it up and start Ironclad this year?
Um, I have always really been drawn to the performance end of physical therapy, and I've always had this really strong belief that a physical therapist should be fitness forward, and we have this really unique place in the healthcare system of being movement experts.
Mhm.
Um, and we're really well positioned to actually teach people about fitness and about like let's not just get better and functional, like how can we be what I call super well or fit. And my day job, I'll call it, allows me to do that to a certain extent, but I wanted more, right? And so I've been in the CrossFit world for 10 years. I've been coaching for a couple of years now. And so I wanted something that would help me kind of link the two and put my PT knowledge together with my coaching and strength and conditioning knowledge. And so Ironclad Physio was born, something I've always really been passionate about. I just never really knew how to put it into practice until this past year. I was like, you just do it.
Yeah, so is it kind of like if someone comes to you with an injury, you start like the baseline of physical therapy and then you just continue with them for like however long it takes to get them back to what they were doing or what they want to be doing in terms of like a overall fitness standpoint?
Yeah, so Ironclad lives in this really special space right now because clinically I practice at Howard Head Sports Medicine. Like that is my employer. That's who I work for. So if you want to see me clinically as a PT, you have to see me there. And that's where the more traditional physio rehab happens. Right now, Ironclad is existing kind of in that online educational space / more of that like wellness performance space. So like I have these two separate identities right now as a physio and like a coach. And so it's like I can meld them a little bit too, right? So if someone comes to me with an injury at CrossFit or wants to talk to me about it, I'm like, hey, come see me in the clinic. Yeah. But when I have a patient who is graduating from PT and who is really wanting to take things to the next level because maybe they, their formal PT is over, then Ironclad can kind of step in and like I can program for you performance wise, like help you with those things that wouldn't really fall under traditional rehab. Maybe one day they will become one, but not yet.
Yeah, totally. So do you kind of want to talk about like your fitness forward approach then? Because that seems like that's what you're trying to achieve with Ironclad.
Sure. It all kind of stems from this very early in my career. I recognized that like as a profession, sometimes we underload our patients. So I'm sure we're all familiar. Like you go to PT, maybe you're getting some clamshells and you're doing some absets, and maybe you're never getting off the bed. And like, oh my God, that's not only is that not going to prepare you for sport, for snowboarding, for CrossFit, for like life. It isn't really building any kind of real resilience or strength. So I recognized that very early on, became very insistent that every clinic that I worked in had to have a squat rack, to the point of my bosses were like, dear God, fine. And just like bought a squat rack and put it in there. And I love him for it. I will forever love him for doing that. And so it was born out of that. And then kind of finding a group of PTs who also thinks the same way. It's called Ice Physio, and started doing some training with them. And just like, it was like my aha moment of like, oh my God, other PTs like me are out there. We believe in loading. We want you to like, I don't just want you to get back to doing your ADLs, we call them in PT, your activities of daily living. I'm like, no, I want you to live. I want you to do the things that you enjoy doing. I want you to do your sport. Like clamshells don't equal snowboarding. They just don't. So as a fitness forward physio, I believe that I should be addressing not only just getting you brutally strong for the things that you want to do, so that I create a little bit of a buffer here. So when you're out, like, I don't know, hitting rails, boxes, sending it off cliffs, things like that, you aren't like pushing the limits of what your body's capable of. No, I've created this buffer for you to like, you can be here and not be like playing with fire. So to me, that's what fitness forward physio is. And I also like to address other energy systems. You come in and you see me, I might put you through what I call a remom, or every minute on the minute. Like I'm going to hit your fast energy systems. We'll keep the term simple. I'm going to hit your middle energy systems, and I might hit your longer energy systems, depending on your sport. So like addressing the whole human in that same like idea, like also making the referrals where necessary, like sports psych or things like that for my higher level athletes.
Yeah, totally. And I agree so much in it. It sucks because I think, like, granted, I'm not a physical therapist, but I have a lot of friends who are physical therapists. So, I mean, feel free to correct me if I'm wrong, but from my understanding, there's like what comes from physical therapy and like you're just on the bed, you're doing clamshells, their whole goal is just to get you back to walking is because you're also most of the time just working off of insurance based in a place where these clinicians are seeing 10,000 patients every hour. And it's like they don't have the time to get you to where you might want to be, whether they want to or not, you know? So it sucks in that respect. And it does suck for the patient too, because a lot of people can't afford more than that. But when you're a high level athlete, you really have to think about that buffer that you're talking about. And it really does come down to a lot more than just being able to walk again or being able to do like a low impact jump or something along those lines.
100%. That is probably the most frustrating thing that we deal with as PTs is like, yeah, sometimes the reason I can't even get to maybe the plyometric part of the rehab process post ACL is for insurance reasons. And like, ooh, that, I mean, you can get me all kind of fired up if we start talking about that, but you hit the nail on the head. Like that is probably the biggest thing we run into. And I'm lucky enough to be in a place where I see patients one-on-one for 40 minutes. And I was very intentional in choosing a place to work that allowed me to do that. But so many PTs are stuck in what we call mills and seeing two patients every 30 minutes. I mean, I know what that feels like because I've done it. And that's, to me, that's not good care. You know,
Yeah,
it's just not.
it's not. It's not. And it sucks because the healthcare system, regardless of PT, just all around, I
You're
feel
in
like
it, right?
this
Like
is,
your day job is in healthcare. Yeah.
yeah. I'm a medical device engineer. So I like was going into clinicians and surgeries and like talking to physicians and stuff. And like that's a whole other side. But yeah, it's the healthcare system's messed up.
It's a little broken. So there's kind of a bit of a movement and with PTs towards this like other like style of
Mhm.
PT. I'm going to use my words carefully here, but like, you know, like cash based type practices and things like that. Because of that, right? Like we're
Yeah.
at least recognizing that this more needs to happen.
Yeah.
And I mean, I hope that for my profession, I really do. Because
Yeah.
I think we're a really uniquely positioned profession to make a big difference in people's lives if we're
Yeah.
willing to accept that responsibility and really lean into it and do the things that we need to do to position ourselves to be able to do that.
Yeah, totally. And what I find a lot with working with snowboarders that have gone to PT previously is they'll come to me and be like, we'll just use an ACL, for example. Like I had an ACL tear and I went to PT for, I don't know, 6, 8 weeks. And like I can walk now, but that's about it. Like I can't do much. And I think when you get thrown into a system like that, a lot of times physical therapists rely on like symptom modification rather than like, okay, root cause, let's get you back. And
Yeah.
again, it just comes down to like the broken medical system. But I find it so important to really work on like root cause of, well, why did you tear your ACL in the first place? Like, I'm not trying to just get your knee working again. We're going back before you tore it. Like,
Yeah.
what caused that? Why was that weak? And how can we fix that? You know?
Yeah. Yeah. I absolutely love that. And it's great to also have professionals like you in the field who like say I have that patient who only gets 20 visits. That is not enough to rehab an ACL. It's just not. But like having a trusted strength and conditioning personnel out there where I could refer out if they can't, you know, if it can't be me or me on the back end, then I can have somebody in the community that I trust is really powerful. And then it also falls on me to be really responsible in how I use my available visits. So I have those talks with patients about like, you got 20. We are about to be really creative.
Yep.
I'm
Really
about to put a
creative.
lot of responsibility on you as the patient because we can get a lot further down this process if you will take some ownership and work really hard at home. We can make this work. But yeah, it's a process. It's interesting.
Yeah, and I think that's just something people have to realize. And I think a lot of people get that when they hit that really low point when they're like, man, I can't snowboard. I can't hang out with my friends. I can't do any of these things. Like I am going to put the work in at home because they're just so in a low with not being able to do any of the stuff that they enjoy. And
Yeah.
so unfortunately, sometimes it takes that low to get people like up and going for it. I mean,
Yeah.
I've been there, but
Yeah.
I mean,
Yeah,
it is
like,
what it
look,
is,
you
you know?
might not have liked the gym before, but you're about to be a gym rat. Just trust me. That's what's great about working in this kind of community, and I'm assuming your community too, is like, I don't really have to cheerlead people very hard here. If anything, I have to like rein them in. Sometimes put on my earmuffs because I'm like, oh, I can't believe you did that. But it's really kind of, they get it, you know, when your social thing is gone and your recreational fun is gone, and like all of your life is essentially, you can't do the things you like to do. They'll put in some work in the gym. All of a sudden they are gym people.
Oh yeah. And I think like honestly I want to hear your perspective on this as well, but when it comes to like performance training specifically for snowboarding, like that's not necessarily a typical gym workouts. There's aspects here and there, but I find it a lot more fun because I'm not in there just like how heavy can I lift this barbell? You know, you're like working on so many different things that makes it kind of fun and challenging. You're like, this should be easy and it's extremely hard.
Yeah, no, I think snowboard specific, like strength and conditioning is so different. Also, I don't, the attention span is not there for like just a bunch of squats and deadlifts. It's just not. And so it's really fun. You have to keep them engaged and creative. Like I will argue that they all are going to get strong in squat and deadlift. And I'm speaking in like a rehab world. Like you have to have some baseline strength for me.
Oh yeah.
But I have to get creative. We got to have some fun because that's also the demands of your sport, right? Like I'm trying to prepare you for like a highly dynamic sport that throws a lot of unexpecteds at you, and your training should reflect that.
100%, 100%. Well, kind of diving into that a little bit, maybe backtracking slightly, I want to like hear your experience from working with all different types of athletes, since you've worked with people in the NFL and the Olympics, obviously snowboarders. So you kind of want to talk about what you find like the difference between working with these kinds of athletes and their different like rehab variances to their different performance variances, and what you find like honestly most enjoyable for you, but also just like the challenges and rewards of working with those kinds of athletes.
Sure. So they all have their similarities and their differences, like from a purely like rehab standpoint. And when you're talking about different athletes, like obviously there are some very similar goals, and I get it's kind of like establishing that baseline of strength in my athletes. So like I worked with a ton of more what I call traditional athletes when I was in New Orleans. It's like a lot of your baseball, a lot of your soccer, a lot of your football, you know, like so you're talking about like return to throw and a lot of upper body hip core stuff for baseball players. You're talking about a lot of core hip lower body stuff for soccer players, and like dynamic like footwork type stuff. And then your NFL guys, like you just have to kind of be prepared for everything. You got to be like brutally strong. That's probably the hardest population I've ever worked on because I'm not very big. I don't know if you can tell, but I'm not that big, and those guys are huge.
They're huge.
So like trying to put my hand around something, like laying on things, but like those guys just need to be strong and powerful, and they need to be able to take a hit. But all of them need a lot of like neurocognitive rehab. If you start to talk about like being able to react to their environment and change direction or speed quickly. Snowboarding was very unique when I first stepped into it, and like learning. So specifically, I traveled with a snowboard cross team, and so like learning that sport was really cool, and like what their demands of sport are, and they're kind of fun. Like they're definitely power athletes, but they're snowboard athletes in that they jump and you know, like yeah, they get hit, you know, like there's just so many different aspects that like go into that, like aside from the nuances of learning like how they like go over like features and how they're very specific in their form and things like that. Like that was its own unique challenge for me to like learn that sport and appreciate that sport. When you start talking about that level of athlete and like traveling with a team during like a training camp or something like that, it's not traditional PT. It's just like they come in at the end of the day and I'm just like, what you need? What hurts? What do we need? I'm not here to like try and blow your mind and like, you know, so it's different in that sense of just like trying to get them, make sure they're okay to be back on stow the next day.
When you were traveling with the cross team, were you putting them through like performance workouts too to help enhance their riding, or was it strictly like injury PT type of stuff?
Strictly PT. So they all come, when you're talking that level athlete, they also all have like, they all had their strength and conditioning and performance stuff on their phone, like in an app, I believe. And so they all had their workouts that they would do every morning. It was all programmed for them by someone at the Co in, you know, Park City. I was there to manage any injury that happened. I was their primary medical, so just praying that nothing serious happened, because there was like, I'm a PT, like we don't generally like have drugs around,
Yeah.
but in my medical kit there are like drugs and things to splint fingers and like all this emergency stuff that like that's my job when I'm on course with them. And then yeah, at night it's just kind of that like, what do you like, dry needling, some Graston, some soft tissue work, maybe a little bit of exercise thrown in there just for the right activation type stuff. But like that was not my role when I was with them.
Yeah, totally. That's crazy though. I did a little bit of cross on a very low level, but it was super fun. Such a cool experience and very different than like anything else in snowboarding for the most part.
Yes, it was. Obviously it was. I knew about it. It was on my like. How do you? I don't know. I'm almost 40. Like I very vividly remember Lindsay Jacob Ellis. Like I've always, like I just remember. I've always like followed snowboarding, and so like it was on my radar, but I didn't have this like deep understanding of what it actually entailed until I got there, and I was like, oh, and like riding through the course to be familiar with the course. So if somebody calls on the radio and is like, we've got an athlete down at turn number 3, like I need to know how to get there. And so like that
Yeah.
was pretty cool. I was like, okay, like going through the course like slowly. Let's just say slowly, but I was like, all right, this is cool.
Yeah, it's super fun. That's so cool that you were just like on site, like literally strapped into your board, ready to go grab
Yeah.
someone. Like that's super cool. I've never really heard or talked to another physical therapist with like a similar experience like that. It's super sick.
Yeah, so I'm very lucky to have that opportunity, and like I said, that's why I packed up my life and moved across the country for that opportunity. And to when
Yeah.
you're, I remember pinching myself standing at the top of the course in Saas and then again in Austria, and just being like, oh God, I can't believe this is real. Like you're doing
Yeah.
it. Yeah.
Seriously, that's super cool. Well, kind of on the same track, since you were doing like a lot more PT and injury stuff for snowboarders, do you want to just talk about like your insights and experience in common injuries among snowboarders? I know it's not a super research topic, which we kind
Yeah,
of talked
sure.
about pre-podcast, but yeah, just any experience you have or you can give people that are listening like some insight. I think is the biggest thing is everyone's like, I just want to do injury prevention. I'm like, well, you can't exactly prevent injury, but you can kind of. So
Yeah, and that's what you do, right? Like get people strong so they can prevent injury. Yeah, it's really, there's obviously the most common thing that we see for snowboarders is shoulders, because we tend to take harder slams. Like our feet are fixed, so we don't really have as much incidence of ACL injury. So I see a lot of like rotator cuff, labral stuff. We go all the way down to a ladder J because you've taken so many slams that your shoulder falls out of socket when you sneeze.
oh,
Broken wrists. I don't really deal with wrists and hands. We have specialists for that, but I know that happens a lot. And so like to that extent, it's hard to say that there's something to prevent those injuries other than like the stronger you are, the I would say maybe the more kind of dynamic control and core you have, maybe you can prevent that fall, because a slam is a slam is a slam, and there's only so much I can do to like really help you with that. But yeah, like you mentioned, there's not a ton of research, but there is one article out there, and they actually did it on border cross, which I thought was really cool. And looking at ACL injuries in border cross athletes, because there's so much research on like what are the predictive factors of an ACL injury in a skier, and then it becomes really easy to extrapolate how do we prevent that as like a PT or a strength and conditioning specialist. But for snowboarders, what they found for these border cross athletes, that 90% of the injuries happened on the front leg. And 2, it was happening usually when they were landing from a jump. So then we could say like, okay, well, we could probably also apply this to some slope style and to park athletes and things, like anyone who's coming off of a jump. And what they found is that the kind of the most common factor was that the tear happened with a really strong eccentric contraction of the quad. So like when you're landing and trying to absorb that jump, quad dominance, what it will do is it can pull that tibia forward, which happens a little more in like skiers because they land really back seat. It can also pull that front knee into a little bit of internal rotation and put you into like a more injury prone position when you're landing from a jump in snowboarding. So there's also the fact that these athletes were landing with a little less knee flexion. So they're landing on a straighter knee, so to speak. So if you've ever watched a CrossFit or CrossFit, snowboard cross athlete, land, they kind of like, they tuck and then their feet come down as they're meeting the snow, and then they tuck again as they hit the snow. So like that initial, like I'm almost extended and then I'm flexing is kind of where that like strong eccentric quad and that injury was happening. So I think that we could take that, because I'm assuming not all of your athletes or your snowboarders are border cross. Like that's just not as common. Like most of us are just out riding recreationally in the park, having some fun. But so if we think about landing mechanics, and how we're landing from these jumps, and if you have that moment to think about it, cool. But if in the gym you can really prepare for it even better, landing with a little bit more of a bent knee, so you're not in that kind of injury prone position for ACL, really beefing up. So if we're like, all right, well, if the really strong eccentric quad contraction is what's getting people, how can we offload that a little bit with some of the other muscles around the joint? So let's think glutes, let's think calves. Wow. Let's think about the core, because the other time that injuries were happening in snowboard cross athletes were during collision and things like that. And so that's a pretty common factor in ACL injury, is being kind of like too much trunk excursion, we call it. So if we can work on core, and really teaching athletes to control their core and have a strong core, that also is going to help if it's a collision, if you're a border cross athlete, or if you're just like landing from a jump and you get a little off axis, or oh man, you didn't really spot it, or we're about to knuckle a jump. Like that's where injuries happen too. Like, can you make that adjustment quick enough to like absorb that force properly, So I think I just spit a lot of things out at you.
No, totally. I'm following, but we can reiterate a little bit for everyone else that's listening.
Yeah.
Something I wanted to mention a little bit that you kind of talked about at the very beginning is that internal rotation of the knee that some people land in. And so I think that's so crucial, because we're taught all the time, just from a lot of coaches, like knees out, knees out, knees out, or just like turn your feet out. It's always in external rotation of our hips and our knees, which is great. And that's a good cue for certain things. But I also think that it creates this like fear of internal rotation for a lot of people. And they're like, I can't internally rotate my knee. That's bad. And that's where I think a lot of these injuries actually occurs, because people have terrible internal rotation and they don't have strength in their internal rotation. And that's when an injury would occur, like an ACL or an MCL or any of those kinds of things.
Yeah.
So something I preach with a lot of people, and I get it, because it's opposite of what you're told. And also like a lot of people just don't know how to apply it, which is fair, is working through rotation. Like strength training through rotation is such a key thing for snowboarding. Like squats are good, deadlifts are good, all these things are good. Doesn't mean you shouldn't be doing them, but it also means that maybe you should do like a rotational Bulgarian split squat, or you should be putting yourself into internal rotation and strengthening it, whether it's mobility or with like actual loading. Because the biggest thing that I see for people is like, I want to be more flexible or have more mobility, and that's great. But if you have that without control and without strength, you're still going to be at a very high risk for injury. So you can't just do that. That's not going to help you the way you think it might help you.
Yeah, absolutely. 100%. Like, I love everything you just said, because internal rotation or valgus collapse of the knee got so demonized.
Yeah.
That you're right. It made people afraid to do it. And it also, I don't know, maybe made some PTs afraid to do it. But like, look at any video clip of a high level, elite level snowboarder, skier, basketball player, soccer player, any athlete. It happens. It is a demand of life to go into a valgus position or an internally rotated position. So it's your job and my job to make sure that those athletes can control it and have strength through it. And that their body can tolerate it. Like if we never train into it, then this first time their knee goes into, a valgus collapse, they probably are going to re-tear or tear, or, but like if we've prepared them or prepared their nervous system and gotten them strong enough to handle it, then they're just better prepared overall for it. Like they're going to be okay, because it's going to happen. So you better be ready for it. And yes, I agree. Like, especially in Summit County, everybody's really good at this. We go forward and back really well. Like our quads are really strong. Like our glute max is really strong. We hike, we bike, we ski, we snowboard, but like no one trains this way or this way. And
Yep.
so a lot of times when people come to me just for a little, like, they want a little performance enhancement, or they're having a little bit of like knee pain or something like that. A lot of times I just kind of have to plug the holes in what they're already doing. And it's really nice. I'm like, cool, I get to hand you like 3 or 4 exercises that you probably never even thought about doing, but are gonna like complete your exercise program that you're already doing. Because most of my patients are already like really doing a great job for themselves.
Yeah.
And so it's nice to just be able to go like boop, boop, boop and plug in 3 new exercises. And they're like, whoa, I feel way better. I'm like, we just had to move you on a couple new planes and you're all right
Yep.
now.
Yep, totally. And I think it's crazy because I mean, I fell into that trap for a long time, or not trap, but you know what I mean,
Yeah.
for a really long time, because that's what you're taught. Like if you're like, okay, I don't know what to do for exercise, I'm gonna start going to the gym. You're like, okay, I do the basic lifting, and it's all in that sagittal plane, and no one ever thinks about anything else. And for a lot of sports, like if you're a runner or a biker or whatever, like not saying you should just be doing that, but a lot of times you can get away with it and not really have a lot of issues. But with snowboarding, like you've mentioned earlier, like it's basically a sport of like, what can you take that gets thrown at you? Like it's not really like a set thing. And especially if you want to get into freestyle, like you're going to be hitting slams in every single direction. You're probably going to split in a few times. You're going to be doing a lot of crazy things that your body has to be prepared to handle, and you have to be ready to take those. And so I think the biggest thing for people, and that biggest disconnect is like, I go to the gym and I do a lot of strength training, and I'm like, that's great. Don't stop doing that. But also do these other things.
Yeah, right. Yep. Because I'm sitting here thinking, I'm like, man, is there even any like rotational machines? Like even, because sometimes people are like, I don't know what to do. So I just go do that little circuit upstairs, that machine circuit. I'm like, not a single one of them moves you except that this machine for your hips.
Your abductors and
get off that, get off there. Yeah. And so that's why that's why I created Ironclad, and like that's what I'm passionate about, and that's what you do. It's just like, man, can we just educate people on that? Like if I make one post or reel that like teaches somebody that they should move into a different plane, and I save them an ACL injury, then that's huge. As someone who's been through an ACL rehab, I'm like, man, if I can save one person from that, that's a big deal.
Yeah, seriously. And it's crazy how small of a change it can be for some people. And it just makes like the world of a difference. And it's so cool, like you mentioned, being able to save someone from something, or just honestly just opening someone's eyes to like, oh, snowboard training doesn't mean I have to go lift a ton of weights. Because like you mentioned earlier, a lot of snowboarders, like they don't want to do that. Like if you're big into snowboard culture, like you won't see them in the gym. They don't want to go lift weights and do bicep curls. So it's fun to be like, well, it doesn't have to be like that.
No, I understand. I live in this community for a reason too. Like there are more fun things to do. Now, granted, I am someone who spends a decent amount of time in the gym because I love it, but I know you don't want to be there for hours. Like I want to be outside too. So yeah, just giving them those couple things that really make a difference for them is huge.
Cool. Well, kind of closing out that topic, are there like a couple things other than what we really mentioned, or maybe like a specific you could mention for people that are like, I really want to prevent injury and I want to feel like strong and resilient on the mountain? Like what would be like a couple things you would mention to them, maybe like a little bit more specific?
Yeah, so you kind of touched on it, like some rotational strengthening.
Mm-hmm.
That can be a billion different versions of exercise. Like that could be a rotational split squat. That can be like a landmine, kind of like, those are great. I would tell a lot of athletes, because I think they miss this piece, core. Like I think a lot of athletes miss their core. And I'm like, it does. Like that is a huge piece in preventing injuries, regardless. Like ACL across the board, core is a piece of it, and so you have to hit it. I don't necessarily care what it looks like. It probably should also have some rotational components to it, but you need to do it. I think single leg strengthening, and people might fight me on that because they're like, well, we're strapped into a board. I'm like, but do you like right? Are you trying to
you press, you hit on rails? Yeah.
So getting some single leg strengthening in there, I think is really important too.
Yeah, well, and I think that's a really good thing to mention, regardless of you doing park, even if you're just like an all mountain carver, it's still important to have single leg strength in terms of the injury prevention. Like you mentioned, if you land wrong, and a lot of people ride back seat without even realizing it. So like those different positions, if you're not competent in one leg versus the other, that's when you're gonna run into injuries.
Yeah, I feel like the more symmetrical you can be, the better.
Yeah.
Um, and then like I'm always a fan of a good strong butt peach, however you want to say it, because like if I'm kind of going back to like how do we maybe take some of that like um emphasis away from the quads when we get into landing,
Yeah.
the butt, like get it really, really strong.
100%. And I think a lot of people run into lower back pain because their glutes are extremely inhibited and they don't
Yeah,
work them. One of the
yeah,
biggest things I give my athletes, so for anyone listening, if you're like, I have lower back pain or you think you have bad landing mechanics, stand up tall, engage your core, and just squeeze your glutes 5 seconds, 5 times, and turn them back on. And
yeah,
then you can go strengthen them.
yeah,
But
get
it
them, get
sounds
them.
so goofy, but it works so well.
It works, and people get so offended when I'm like, so I've kind of moved away from telling people their glutes are weak because they get all like, oh, like, okay, well, they're not like weak in the sense that like you just fall over when you stand up, but they're not showing up to the party on time.
Yep.
And that can have huge consequences, right? So we're just trying to get them, we could always be stronger, but we're
Yep.
trying to get them timed a little bit better so
100%.
that when you land from a jump or you hit a big drop and you're like, oh, I'm in the back seat, kind of like how your glutes are going to help shoot you back up out of there.
100%. 100%. Well, awesome. One of the last things I wanted to talk about, we kind of mentioned in the beginning, is hips. You work
Yeah,
with Tommy's hip, and a lot of people, he started to post about it recently, maybe in the last year, and a lot of people are very interested in it because a lot of people as we age start to get these injuries, and it's cool to like relate to someone that's dealing with something.
absolutely.
But I hear from a lot of people in general, regardless of Tommy's injury, is just I need more hip strength. I need more hip mobility. My hips hurt, blah, blah, blah. So I wanted to get your input as a physical therapist on like snowboard hips. And then we can dive more into Tommy's as well. But like, what would you say to people that are like, my hips, my hips, my hips?
Yeah. I it's get stronger, but get stronger in all the planes. So a lot of people probably know how to get their glutes stronger, but are you getting your glute med and your glute min stronger? Are you getting your rotational or your hip rotators stronger? Things like airplanes, or like we keep coming back to rotational split squats, things like that. Are you getting your true hip flexor strong?
Yeah.
Hugely missed in back pain and like hip pain. Runner, like just a lot of other athletes really miss like true deep hip flexor training and will tend to overuse their quad or their TFL.
Mhm.
So making sure that we're working on that is really important. And then like learning how to dissociate your hip movement from other things.
Mhm.
So dissociating your hip from your lumbar spine specifically. Can you move your femur in its socket like an airplane without your back also moving? Can you hip hinge without your back flexing? Those types of things. So I don't know if that answered your question, but
Yeah,
there's
totally. I just want like a lot of people just come to me with like hips, and obviously hips are a giant joint. They're a huge ball and socket, but so it should be able to do this, and most people are kind of here.
yeah,
So it's super important to one, regain that range of motion. But to me, like I've mentioned, and I will continue to preach the rest of my life, is like strength through range of motion.
yeah,
Like you just sitting there and stretching your hips and then going to try and land a giant jump is not the best idea.
yeah,
Like you need to strengthen those areas so that
terrible
you one can have it, but you can land it, you can use it. So I
yeah,
think it's super, super important that you mention like hip airplanes and like your glutes are a part of your hips. So people think hips and they think of one section, they think of bringing their knee to their chest, but your glute medius, your TFL, all those things are aspects of your hips that you're probably missing out on, which is probably a reason why your hips are restricted or hurting or just feel like they're not quite there.
yeah. You said it. Like snowboarding is just a game of like, what can you handle? It's like getting thrown into a tumbler and just thrown around. Like, can you handle it? And so making sure your hips are mobile in all directions. And I'm not just talking flexible, because flexible just implies that the tissue can stretch, but mobile is can you move through your available range? And then are you strong in all planes, all motions,
Yep.
under any weird condition?
100%.
Yes.
100%.
Yes.
I will preach that till the day I die because I
I
think
love
it's,
it.
I'm a nerd when it comes to like definitions, I guess,
Yeah,
like
cool.
word definitions. And I feel like so many people throw around so many different words, and I'm like, oh, I don't think you mean what you think you mean.
Yeah. Yeah.
So yeah, I love when other people like recognize like those kind of things that we just mentioned. But
Yes.
yeah.
Yeah, absolutely.
Well, cool. Kind of jumping into Tommy's, obviously, patient confidentiality. I don't want you to like go too hard into things, but I guess kind of mention like Tommy came to you because if people don't know, it's a genetic condition where he had a torn labrum and he had to get surgery, and now it just really, really affects him, and it's really hard to move. So if you want to just kind of talk about what you do for him in case someone is dealing with something similar or they have a similar pain, maybe they could get some inspiration on how to move forward from it.
Sure. So Tommy, as an athlete, you have to think about where in your season is the athlete. So Tommy's in season right now, which changes how I approach Tommy's hip. But so yeah, he had his labral tear. He had it repaired. He went to formal rehab. He was one of those people that kind of got stuck in the insurance system, and like it got cut off probably sooner than it really needed to. And so in a perfect world, I would love to like jump in hard and like he won't let me dry needle him. I'm sure he won't care if I say that. He will not let me near him with dry needles. But like do all the soft tissue work and then really start working on everything we just talked about in terms of like mobility, stability, and strength in all the planes. But Tommy's in season, so I have to manage volumes of things, right? So his snowboarding volume is high. I'm pretty sure he's been out every single day of the season since opening day.
It's so ridiculous like that.
And I'm not going to change that. And also, as like a fitness forward physio, I'm not going to tell him not to do that.
Yeah.
Because I do not believe in rest. And like complete rest, I think is bullshit. And rest is rust, if you want to ask me my opinion. So Tommy's going to snowboard because Tommy has to snowboard, and Tommy will go bonkers if he doesn't snowboard. And it's also his livelihood. And so when I see Tommy, it's a management of symptoms, which is a little, usually we kind of talked about that. Like we don't love that. So when I first started seeing him, I would do some of my soft tissue work, and then I would try to start loading him up, and like some things would feel good, and then other things would just make his hip mad, because his hip, I have to meet his tissue where it's at in terms of what it can tolerate from a loading perspective. And like there's really no room for me to, there's nothing left there for me to do, because he's put so much load through it with snowboarding already. So I kind of had to take this, like, which I don't traditionally like to take. It's against everything we already talked about, but of this like symptom management PT, because it's going to get Tommy through his season. And he's on this note, he still does a lot to keep himself strong. Like Tommy is still in the gym.
He's crazy
still
strong.
working.
He really is.
Yeah, he's crazy strong. He's crazy, like agile and athletic. He makes CrossFit look easy, which drives me bonkers sometimes. But he's putting in the work to keep himself strong. And I also know that as his PT, which is nice to know. I know exactly what he's doing because I'm his coach also. And I can kind of see what that loading looks like, what his snowboarding loading looks like. I see him modify, like he's not trying to like go all out in his workouts all the time, because his priority is snowboarding. So I know that he's still getting strong, and he's still moving through all of these planes and working all of these things. So my job now is just to try to keep his hip happy as possible so he can go out and snowboard. So right now that looks like a lot of soft tissue work. He definitely has a lot of compensations, I would say. And he's overusing like some adductors and some things like that. He's not super strong in some of those rotators and those deep hip flexors. And I can make him feel a lot better when I work on those things. Like it feels awful when it's happening. Like he hates it because he's grimacing the whole time, but I'm just like getting into his adductors, and it gives him a ton of relief. And if I am going to add a little bit of activation afterwards, I will, but it's like hand resisted or super light band, because anything more puts him into a bad spot. And I can't do that, because then he can't go snowboard the next day. So it is the opposite of everything we just said on like how I have to manage it. But that's part of being a fitness forward physio. And it's part of what you do too, is like looking at your athlete as a whole and what are they doing out on the mountain? What are they doing in the gym? And what can I do to complement that? So right now I do a lot of soft tissue work and a little bit of activation on Tommy's hip, and it makes him feel a lot better. And he gets to go out and snowboard the next day. And when off season comes, we're going to flip the script, and that's going to look different.
Yeah, totally. Because I love what you mentioned about like compensation. And when I was with Tommy, I was trying to figure out his compensating patterns too, because that's just like where my first thought process goes with people that have like a muscular pain issues. I'm like, well, you're overusing something, you're underusing something. So basically figuring that out and then refacilitating those muscles so that you can work better as a whole. But yeah, it's hard when, because his issue is like very specific too. And like you mentioned earlier with the tissue, like where it's at and how often he uses it, it's a really like delicate balance. When I was messing with his hip and stuff, he was having me do stuff, and I was like, wow, this is different than what I've ever worked with before.
Yeah, the difference between like making him feel better and be able to get back out on the mountain and like totally pissing his hip off, it is like razor thin.
Yep.
So I had to find that line. It took me a couple times to find that line, a couple times of being like, sorry, like but you have to push, right? Or you'll never find the line. And then knowing what we're going to do. And like I said, when season's over and the snow is gone, we'll talk about some of, like, hopefully I can get into more of what I know he needs. Yeah.
Cool. Well, basically want to close this out. We touched on a lot of like great stuff that I think a lot of people can benefit from. But like you mentioned earlier, you're in Breckenridge, and a lot of my listeners live in Colorado and might want to work with you, go to CrossFit, or need you for PT. So if you want to just plug all your stuff in so people can go and find you, go ahead and do that.
Yeah, sure. Clinically, I practice at Howard Head Sports Medicine in Breckenridge. That is where you come to me if you have an injury or pain or like a script from a doctor. But the thing I'm most proud of and thing I love the most is Ironclad Physio. It exists online on all the socials at Ironclad Physio, YouTube, TikTok, Instagram, Facebook, all of them. And that is where I provide my like educational videos. That's where you can, DM me, ask me questions. Like, yes, I live in CrossFit world, but I spend a lot of time in snowboard world, and I'm very passionate about snowboard world. So Ironclad Physio is not just CrossFit. So you can check me out there too. And I have a website as well. And I'll be dropping a new logo pretty soon that I'm pretty excited about.
Ooh, I just did that. So fun.
Yeah, I'm stoked on it. I love my logo, and it meant a lot to me when I started it, and it will never go anywhere, but I had to give a little like to New Orleans in my new logo, and I'm pretty pumped about it.
That's super cool. Well, awesome. Thank you so much for coming on. I know so many people will love to listen to this, and I think just really learn what they can do differently to start making improvements in their snowboarding and their performance. So again, thank you for coming on, and I'm just so stoked to hopefully meet up with you. I'm trying to come out to Summit soon.
Yeah, come ride.
Yeah, that'll be super cool. But awesome. Well, have a good rest of your day.
Yeah, thanks for having me on.